Welcome to the OR Today webinar series. We're excited to have nearly 100 registered attendees for today's webinar. The third annual OR Today Live Surgical Conference will be held August 27 through 29 at the Hyatt Regency Reston, Washington, D.C. Registration is now open and details are available online at ortodaylive.com. We will award an OR Today Live surprise pack to the first attendee today that can tell me how many American flags encircle the base of the Washington, D.C. monument. Use the question feature on your webinar dashboard to answer the question now. While you're answering the question, I do want to remind you that today's webinar is eligible for one continuing education hour. To obtain the certificate, you must complete the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly after today's presentation. If you do not receive the survey, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. All right, and let's see who today's winner for the OR Today Live prize pack will be. Renee Gouda. Congratulations. The correct answer was 50, representing all 50 states. Our presenter today is Dr. Cheryl Nance, Principal of Dean Associates, a healthcare firm specializing in perioperative leadership development, infrastructure, and clinical practice improvements for hospital-based and freestanding facilities. Cheryl, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and welcome to Harnessing Your Vision. I'm so excited to be able to present this information to you today. We'll use our brief time together to examine how to harness your vision. What develops your vision? What are the components of your vision so that you can create a culture of safety and a culture of service excellence for your patients, your staff, and your physicians? For those new leaders who are attending today, I hope that you begin to differentiate what is really critical as you work as a leader in perioperative services. And for those experienced leaders, I hope that you gain a new kernel of knowledge or creativity as a result of this session. The outcomes that I'd like you to take from this session are the actions of understanding mindfulness, being able to identify your challenges while we're doing our session, and taking the usable tools to create a draft vision. And the final thing is to create a plan of action. These all contribute to creating an organizational effectiveness for your perioperative services. The objectives for this session I have listed: focusing on values, focusing on the linkage of performance improvement and organizational effectiveness, and taking time to look at how values facilitate or deter our practice, and then again reviewing change theory. And I want to, as we go through this, to remember that change and changing are two different things that you have to manage when you are looking at improving your culture and increasing your organizational effectiveness. So are you dreaming something that is just wonderful, that is uplifting, or are you having a nightmare with your vision? And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is creating that vision so that it is an achievable dream. It is something that you're able to integrate into your daily practice and develop your staff and your physicians in a process that creates that stellar experience for your patients. Is your vision clear? Have you written down what your vision is? Are you tracking what you're doing? How have you communicated your vision? Are you on the dark side of your vision, or are you on the illuminated side of your vision? So today we're going to talk about research, about culture, about competing values framework, about change and changing. Then we'll talk a little bit about organizational effectiveness, performance improvement, and then I'll take you into some tools that I am providing for you to assist in your developing of your vision. I saw this image as sometimes what I get to go through. How do I pull information out of my head when it's so full of so many things? I want you to be able to tease out what's critical. Tease out that creativity that you have in your brain and make use of it. So really, harnessing your vision means that you need to have a vision in place. And we're going to talk about developing that vision so that you can harness it, implement it, and make it happen for you and your staff and for your organization. There are 5 major steps in developing your vision, and we will step through each one of them. And as we proceed that, we have to remember that developing a vision requires mindfulness. It requires contemplation time. I don't know about you, but I find that I'm always so busy, I don't set aside the time I need. And that is something that I strongly urge you to do, is set aside planning time so that you can reflect on what's happening right now versus where do I need to be? Where does our practice need to be? And mindfulness influences both. So let's start with doing a little quick look at culture. Culture is something that influences what we do and how we interact with those that we work with. Culture basically is derived from these particular 5 things. Norms are what's our daily practice, our rituals of we always do it this way, our rights, our beliefs. And when our beliefs are going in different directions, it's really hard to have a solidified process. Our values do directly influence our culture. So our culture is comprised of these things, and our culture is defined through assumptions, through leadership styles, and these other language and symbols. Our standards are a reflection of our culture. And of course, how we define success is critical as well. Have you established a learning culture within your department? Or have you established a blame-oriented culture? The difference is so monumental. And it's really important that you assess, where are you at? How are you handling issues? Culture is sometimes intangible. You can feel it. Stop and think about the last time that you walked into an operating room and the tension was so high you were able to cut it with a knife. Stop and think about that for a minute. What did you feel? Did you feel like this patient is being well cared for? Or did you say, whoa, what's going on in this room and how can I intervene? It's demonstrated through our relationships, through our ability to communicate clearly. When things aren't going well, we need to be able to speak up and say, this is important. We need to pause for a moment and make sure that what we're experiencing is not detrimentally impacting our patients. Culture is critical for the leader because the leader influences the culture. Hayes Group did a study back in 2005 and discovered from their perspective that leaders drive about 70% of cultural factors. Stop and think about what that means. 70% of the tone in your operating room is derived from you and your style. You are instrumental. You are the critical person who sets the tone. And how you set that tone is going to establish what's expected in your operating room. Edgar Schein has done a lot of research, and he's written a book about corporate culture survival. And learning new culture is tough. So if you're looking to improve your culture, then you're going to be directly involved in that process. The next research I'd like to bring to your attention is competing values and how leaders have to balance the competing values, recognizing that culture and values are intertwined. Back in the 80s, research was done on competing values, and they elicited significant information on how culture influences management. Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn's book on diagnosing organizational culture describes the process, and if you feel like doing a fun experiment, inside the book is an actual survey on what your culture is like, and you can actually do a culture survey in your department and find out what your staff believe is the culture. The competing values framework is divided into the 4 quadrants, and balancing out internal and external forces that drive those values. And the internal and external forces look at flexibility and discretion and stability and control. And each of the 4 quadrants has very specific expectations from the leader. So there's leadership style, there's what's driving the values, and then the theory of how it's effective. And I'm going to take us through each quadrant. So the collaborative, pardon me, the collaborative quadrant deals with relationships, and the theory of effectiveness is that human development and participation produce effectiveness. We all know that we're only as good as our slowest learner or our least effective person, and so we're always striving to make sure that our staff have competence. Being a leader and focusing on the relationship development means that you have to be a mentor, you have to be a builder of teams, you have to engage people in what you're doing, which means that you have to have a value of commitment, communication, and development. This is where that learning culture begins to grow and come about. The second quadrant on the internal side is controlling. Now, controlling isn't always a positive word, but the reality is we have to create boundaries in our practice. And the theory of effectiveness for controlling is that if we control and are efficient with capable processes, we're actually going to be efficient and effective. So we have to coordinate, we have to monitor, we actually have to organize and make sure things are getting done. So this is where our accountability comes into play. We have to value efficiency and timeliness and consistency and uniformity. Stop and think about, how do we manage our first case on-time starts? Are we kind of lackadaisical and, well, the docs will get here when they get here? Or are we posting a notice saying, yesterday we were 30% on time, and starting to talk about how do we make it happen? I've worked with organizations who've been able to achieve 90% on-time starts on a consistent basis. And others I've walked in the door and they're barely making 30%. I've also worked with a client who had 16 operating rooms and were bringing all of their staff in at 6:30, except that 1/3 of the rooms didn't start until 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, which means you had staff here early doing absolutely nothing, and then, gee whiz, we're having this whole lot of overtime in the afternoon because we don't have the staff appropriately aligned. This is where the controlling, being effective in how we use our resources and our processes. Creativity is another component of competing values, and the thought is that if we are, pardon me, if we are effective, then we're going to look for what's innovative. What are the new resources? How do we introduce a better product? So being an innovator is part of the leadership role, being an entrepreneur, being visionary, and this is why I'm addressing the issue of harnessing your vision. How do you incorporate creativity into your daily work life? You have to value the innovation. You have to value transformation. That last word of agility is important because being agile means that when something changes, it doesn't take you 3 weeks to make a decision about where you're going to do. You actually are able to make a decision about a change in process within a very short period of time, and you're able to implement it and getting it up and running. Competing is the last quadrant, and competing means that you are being market-driven. And stop and think about where we're at with CMS payments and the reality of value-based purchasing. We have to be aggressively competing, and our customer has to be our focus. That patient should be our epicenter of everything we do. And the belief is that when we are competing effectively, we are going to make sure that we are running at our highest level of efficiency and making the right decisions to care for our patient. Goal achievement's important, and this is where we need to make sure that our department goals and objectives are aligned with our organization. So here's the managerial competencies that flow into competing values. We have to be collaborative. We have to manage our teams. We have to be controlling, which means we are monitoring what we're doing. This is where our performance improvements comes in. What are we doing to make sure that we are improving? Being creative and getting the newest and the brightest concepts in place in our daily practice. And then competing. How are we energizing our employees? This is critical as we look forward to developing our vision. So back to pulling out of our mind, how do we engage our staff? How do we engage ourselves to make that vision become a reality? We've talked about culture, we've talked about competing values. Let's move now to change and change theory. And I'm going to start with the concept of mindfulness. Is your mind full of all the things you have to do, which, by the way, I think that's where we all are? And how frequently do we actually move into quiet time and reflect and say, where do I really need to be? Is it just that daily grind, or do you actually set aside time at least every week to contemplate what is currently happening in my practice as a leader? Where do I need to be? What is it that I can do to make things better? I have an example of being mindful and being reflective in practice I want to share with you. The reality is, I helped to open a hospital, and it was a fairly nice size organization, and the reality was everything was kind of thrown into sterile processing without regard to organization or process. And about a month into opening the facility, the staff said, we just can't do this. It's not working well. So we agreed to come in for a weekend, and we planned to start at 7, and our goal was we would be done by 5 o'clock. We spent 5 hours actually mapping out where things should be placed, what should be grouped together, and then we spent 3 hours moving every single item in sterile processing. And at the end of the day, everybody was excited because we had flows put together. We knew how things would come together. We actually practiced case picking. And with the advent of the new locations, we were able to cut case cart pulling supplies by 50%. Taking the time to plan is absolutely an incredible process, and you can achieve so much so quickly by taking that time to plan. So change theory, there's a lot of change theorists out there, and the reality is I like things simple, so I wanted to present you and remind you about LEWIN's theory of change. He believes that there's basically 3 stages of change. You unfreeze it, You change whatever it is that you're changing, and then you refreeze, you freeze the new behaviors. Well, that's nice, and it seems fairly simple and straightforward. You can change that with a process, and it looks good on paper. The catch comes in making it clear how the staff need to be changing their interaction with the process. I like Bridges' theory of transition because, again, it's 3 steps, but he approaches the transition of change from the standpoint of, for change to occur, you have to let go and say goodbye to something, and then you have to work through, how do I perform in my new environment, and then I'm able to move into my new beginning. So he breaks it down into 3 stages, and he calls that middle stage the neutral zone. I like to call it the chaos zone because the reality is it's chaotic when you're letting go of something and then engaging in something new. And it's a process, and the staff have to understand what's in it for me, because that's their question. What's in it for me? And it may not be what they really want to hear, because it may not directly affect them from the standpoint that it's an improvement to patient care. But if they're an engaged employee, they're going to want to engage in improving patient care. So where are you headed? What's going on as you make change? And most changes flounder because of communication. Communication, you can never have enough communication when you're working with people. I like this statement from Frederick Douglass back in the 1800s of, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And I find that people struggle to make changes, and they struggle with changing their thinking. And Kubler-Ross has a nice changing versus change curve, and it follows similarly to her grief and loss process of how people grieve. Because when you stop and think about it, if I have to give up something, I'm losing something. So actually engaging in the reality of, I'm letting go and I'm moving into something new. Now, I like this format because on the right-hand side you see the colored rectangles, and the reality is these are the leadership responsibilities in helping the staff change. Creating an alignment between where you're headed and what you're wanting to achieve, and letting go of the past is part of the leadership job. Maximizing your communication. There are so many ways to communicate, and I know that it's never enough. Staff want to hear it, and then they say, I've already heard about it, but then you're always going to have that staff who comes up and says, I didn't know that. And it's, well, it's been in the staff minutes, it's been posted, and you start identifying, and the reality is they've heard about it and have forgotten, or they're just pulling your leg. So sparking motivation is also part of your job, and developing capability and then sharing knowledge. This is all the role of the leader in helping staff engage in the changing process. Consider how you can support your staff in letting go and embracing the change. Edgar Schein, in his work, talked about how do you change culture and how do you embrace where you're headed. And he said it's a key issue for leaders to actually identify, what do I need to let go of that I'm really competent in, and I have to set that aside, or marginalize, he calls it, so that I can identify what are the attributes of what I'm currently doing, or what are the things I'm currently doing that I need to take with me into the new, and then let go of the rest. And that is probably the hardest challenge, because all of us like to feel competent, and when we're learning something totally new, it is a struggle to say, geez, I haven't felt this new of a learner in years. And that's something that is required of leaders as they adapt to a new culture. So as we look at developing our vision and harnessing that to have an effective department, we've talked about culture, we've talked about competing values, and we've talked about change and changing. Let's move on now to, what is your vision? What have you thought about? What is really exciting to you that you just really want to get a hold of, but you don't have the time? I'd like you to take 15 seconds and jot down 3 words that describe your vision. Just 3 words. Take that piece of paper that's sitting beside you. Jot down 3 words. I'll give you 15 seconds. Okay, you've got your 3 words. Now I want you to hang on to those 3 words as we go through how do we develop our vision. We start with researching. Researching is actually a fun time, and you can get staff involved in this process, reviewing literature for what are some of the new practices out there, talking with your physicians, talking with your vendors, talking with your support people like supply management, what things are changing in their workflow that would contribute to improving your workflow in perioperative services. Aligning your department and organizational goals and outcomes is absolutely your foundation for developing your vision. Then you move on to defining current realities. When you're defining your current realities, this is exactly where you want to engage your staff or at least your leadership team. I find going into a room and posting flip charts on the wall and identifying particular arenas where you want to find out what's working and what's not working. Allow the staff, the leaders to be involved in this process because you will gain so much information so quickly. And as you're able to gain this information, you can use this to begin to create your future story. The clarity of your surgeon satisfaction and your staff satisfaction have to be part of your current realities. So part of this process of developing your vision means that you also have to take a look at your personal vision and your department vision, and you need to be clear where you're wanting to head people, because as you start to define your current realities, you're going to spend time with the staff and invite your high energy staff to participate. When you're doing this work session, I suggest you have an outside facilitator come in to help keep you out of the weeds, because it's easy to recreate history, and that's not where you're headed. You're wanting to define what are your current realities, what is working and what is not working. And then have a second session for visualizing the future. Maybe have this just with your leadership group. Visualizing the future is, where do you want to be in 5 years? What kind of an operating room do you want? What's your level of competency? How are the practices aligned with standards? The how will the roles be defined question is an important question, and I recommend that you address the roles as the very last component of what your future is going to look like. Because as you develop your future and you develop that structure, don't worry about the roles. Figure out how you're going to do your business. How are you going to get the patients into your operating room? How are you going to make things come more smoothly? How is your materials management going to work with you differently? So the roles don't get defined until the very end, because that's when you begin to identify what do you really need to be effective. Create that cover story, and that cover story describes that future. And as you create that cover story, get everybody's cover story together and look at what's working, what's not working, and then the cover story, and identify what are those themes. Because the themes are going to help you begin to strategize where you're at and how you're going to create your goals. And once you have the themes clear, then your goals come out of that, and then you can move into your tactics. So as you prepare to implement, you're going to have your strategies and your goals, and the outcome of that is going to be the action plan. So creating that action plan, we all know, well, I've got this action plan and that action plan. What's the underlying importance of having that action plan? And number one is having target dates and being clear as to who's responsible for that particular action. And then monitoring the progress. This is where a lot of great things fall into an abyss with no bottom to it because we aren't monitoring and tracking. And the fun part about monitoring and tracking what's going on is that when a major step is completed, you get to celebrate and you get to let everybody know, hey, we've gotten this far, and you can actually have fun with it. And of course, you're evaluating as you go through the process because you have to course correct when you need to. So you've got 3 words sitting on a piece of paper beside you. I'd like you to add 3 more words that will help you write your vision statement. I'll give you 15 seconds. Three more words, just simple words that are action-oriented that you're going to be able to use to actually write out your statement. Generate movement in those words. Make sure that those words are going to create action and give you that impetus to keep moving forward. So how do you achieve getting that vision finalized? You have to engage the staff. You have to engage not only the staff, but the physicians. You have to engage your support departments, the admitting. Invite your executive team to be part of this. Talk with them. Let them know where you're headed. Be clear about decision making in terms of if you have a work group working on a particular project, are they clear about what decisions they can make, what decisions they need to run by you and they then move forward, or what decisions you have to make. The clarity of that decision-making process makes a difference in how you move forward. I worked with a RNFA who was very focused on AORN standards, but when I brought forth AORN standards and said we need to be addressing these, she became very unhappy with me, and we sat down and talked about it. And she said, you know, a couple months later, I don't necessarily agree with the way you went through this, but I agree with the outcome, and I feel it's important that we do abide by the standards. That was pretty exciting. I thought, wow, this does make a difference, engaging people, because you don't have to have everybody agreeing with you, but you do need to be clear that here are our standards, this is where we're heading, and my expectation is that the standards will be met. Organizational effectiveness is an efficiency with how you meet your objectives. I looked up the definition for this, and the main measure of organizational effectiveness for a business is generally expressed in how well its net profitability compares with the target profitability. So how is your organization doing with its margin of profit? The OR contributes to the profitability, and that means as leader, you have to be aware and balance that under your controlling and under your competing in your competing values. I took a look at some work done by Bob Anderson and Bill Adams on organizational effectiveness, and they identified really 6 systems that are required to be effective. You have to have metrics, you have to have accountability, communication, the delivery system, human performance, and in the middle of their little circle of these 5 items that we've identified so far is leadership. And being able to articulate the vision and the strategy and defining the culture, that's the responsibility of the leader. And as leader of perioperative services, you can have major influence in your organization by how you manage and make things happen in your department. So you can really contribute, you can influence based on the ability for you to provide quality, to be agile in what you do, and to engage your stakeholders and fulfill people's sense of satisfaction. So when I apply that to perioperative services, schedule planning and schedule administration really is the fulcrum of how the operating room works. When you have the planning in alignment with the schedule, with the administration, you can have a balanced schedule. How much attention do you pay to the turnover time? How much attention do you pay to how scheduling is being done? Evaluating your workflow processes, you can find quite a bit of waste, and as you reduce that waste, you are able to improve your productivity. And of course, the last issue of accountability applies to everything we do. So performance improvement is something we do every day. We're always looking for ways to make things better. And again, that goes back to accountability. I was working with a small organization, and they wanted to shut their operating room down when there was no volume. And it's like, well, okay, but what happens if a surgeon wants to add on a case at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and everybody left at noon? Well, he can put it on for the next day. When you have a business and your business is supposed to be open from 7 to 5, that means that your business is open from 7 to 5. And you're not going to generate volumes when you don't have staff available. So for those who have small volume operating rooms, yes, you need to be aware of your productivity, and you also need to be able to deliver the product that you say you're going to deliver. And the product that the OR delivers is operating time. So you want to apply your lean thinking and say, where can I get rid of the waste so that I can make sure that I always have staff available to deliver the product? So creating that vision, how are you going to make that happen? I'd like us to talk a little bit about maintaining our vision. How do we harness it? We've talked about that. Harnessing it, making sure that we have a clear understanding of what our culture is and how we're balancing our competing values, and understanding that change impacts people and that we have to help people go through that changing process. That's how we harness our vision. And then how we begin to maintain our vision. I've got 4 items here identified, and I'd like to share with you an annual assessment that I found online. And that is Michael Dowling. He's president and CEO of Northwell. Every year he sits down and asks himself some questions, and I have identified those questions here for your review. What happened in this last year? Did it go well on a scale of 1 to 5? Where would you put your performance as a leader? Where would you put your performance as a department? Were you transforming in your leadership, or were you complacent and just saying, man, things are going okay, don't need to worry? Is your passion still present? Are you still engaging people and encouraging people to meet their passions? Is your leader team still a team, or are all of your supervisors and managers going different directions? Is there clarity with your short-term and long-term goals? Communication. Ensuring organization is relevant to the future. So you not only have to make sure that your operation is going well, but as a leader, you have to also be paying attention to what's happening in your organization and how it's responding to things such as value-based purchasing. How are you contributing to the future of your organization by your leadership in perioperative services? Take the time each year to reflect. on these questions and how you are leading perioperative services. The second tool I'd like to provide for you is called mind mapping. And I know that probably a lot of you have done mind mapping, but stop and apply it to what's going on in your department. Mind mapping helps you just brainstorm, use your colors, get out a pad of paper and a bunch of colored markers and start drawing a mind map for a project that you're working on. What are the things that is keeping you? What are your barriers? Identify those barriers. You've all done project work in some way, shape, or form. Apply mind mapping because you actually can make something tangible on paper and you can keep playing with it and improving it and making it become a record of your progress. I created a sample vision mapping for a department that I was working with in creating a vision for them. And I started with surgery operations. What are the things that impact surgery operations? And as you can see, there are 5 branches. There's schedule administration, there's material and equipment, staffing, leadership roles, and schedule planning. As I've mentioned earlier, schedule planning and schedule administration is the fulcrum of operations for surgery. You have to have appropriate leadership, and you'll have to be supported by materials and equipment. And of course, staffing is the mix of people and all of the things that come along with HR issues. All of that combines into surgery operation. I then took each of these branches, like schedule administration, and separated that onto a separate piece of paper and developed more information about each of the small branches under schedule administration. So I ended up with a total of 6 vision maps to help figure out where do we need to be and what are the key components of that. The last tool I'd be happy to share with you is the action plan. I had a client share this with me, and they had developed this so that in the far right column you identify, is it complete, not complete, or in progress, and depending on what letters you place in that cell, you change the color of the column next to it. So anything in green means that you have completed it, and you're very clear. It's a quick, easy visual for you to monitor what you're doing for your action plans. So implications for our future. Going through an assessment planning, being very methodical is part of developing that vision. I strongly encourage each of you to create a vision statement and then create the written action plan. As you move forward, you can go back and evaluate, you can course correct, you can celebrate all of the wonderful things you've been able to achieve, and that recalibrating as you need is going to be a major balance for you as you move forward. But you're creating your future, and that's where you want to be. So we've talked about the research of culture, of competing values, and change and changing. We've talked about organizational effectiveness, and we've provided tools for implementation support. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation. I have a bibliography. If you would like that bibliography, you're certainly welcome to email me and ask me for that. And I have for you my contact information. I thank you for your time and attention, and I hope that you are able to leave with a sense of, this is my vision that I want to make happen, and move forward with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was a great presentation. And while you were speaking, we did receive a few questions from the attendees, but I want to take time now to remind everyone that you still have time to submit a question for the Q&A. We're going to try to get through as many as possible with the time that's allotted, but any questions that we cannot address during the live webinar, we'll send over to Cheryl afterwards for her to follow up offline. So do feel welcome to either chat us a question or use the question feature on your dashboard. But Cheryl, the first question, how have you applied How have you applied the competing values to perioperative leadership practice?
That's a fun question because competing values is something that I encounter every day. I have doctors wanting one thing, I have staff wanting something else, I have supply chain giving me information, I have the admitting department coming from another avenue, I have my boss coming to me and saying, Cheryl, this has to change because CMS has done this. So no matter where I turn, I'm always juggling different priorities, and I'm able to identify from competing values, I need to work on being able to manage relationships, the collaboration. I have to be able to manage the controlling part of establishing what our boundaries are. I have to be innovative and integrate so that I am being creative in what I'm doing. And I also have to be competitive because I have to be monitoring my bottom line and assuring that the business is generating revenue and not losing revenue.
Next question is, how do I integrate my vision with the reality of running the OR?
I see my vision as being the bullseye of the target, and my target incorporates the schedule planning, the schedule administration, my HR issues, my supply chain. If you'll recall, my mind map addressed 5 particular things. So my target is focused on, my vision is my center, and my vision has to be that my patient-centric care is that focus. So it's a bullseye for me.
All right, another attendee would like to know, where have you used mind mapping with your staff?
I was working with a client who had made the decision to modify the role of the clinical coordinator. They were spending 100% out of the operating room, 100% of their time, and they made the decision that that's not where they wanted to be, that they needed to have more clinical input. And the role was rewritten to be 50% clinical and 50% administrative. And I used mind mapping with them to, first of all, mind map what were they currently doing, and I used that mind map and then had them go through and identify where were the things that they saw as critical that they needed to take into their new role, because that's what would constitute the balance between clinical and administrative. And once we got those themes from the current practice, then I had them mind map out what the new role would look like and what was important that they visualized for that. And it really helped clarify in their thinking that balancing clinical and administrative time was going to add value to the physicians and to the staff.
I like this question. I have an attendee that said during the presentation you asked us to write down 3 words. What 3 words would you have written down?
Let me pause a moment. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think I would write down patient, leadership, and accountability.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl, for a great webinar. Again, we want to thank you for your time and the knowledge that you shared with us today. Attendees, you do see some contact information on your screen right now. If you have additional questions or if you'd like to reach out to Cheryl at your convenience, please jot down the telephone numbers and or the email address and LinkedIn profile. One lucky attendee today will win an Amazon gift card for completing the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. If you do not see the survey, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. You must complete the survey to obtain the certificate of attendance for the CEUs. For additional information on upcoming webinars, please visit ortoday.com. We'll see you next month. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.